Hi, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on the Tromsø Recommendations for the Citation of Research Data in Linguistics. Today, I'm going to talk about the recommendations themselves and also a little bit about the ecosystem surrounding the recommendations. So I'll talk a little bit about how they came to be, and then a little bit about what we imagine for the recommendations going forward into the future. Before I start, though, I want to acknowledge a few people who made this presentation possible today. First of all, I want to thank my two co-chairs in the Research Data Alliance Linguistic Data Interest Group, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, Helena Andreasen and Lauren Gaughan. I also want to thank our co-authors for the recommendation, Lauren Collister, Philip Conzet, Conrad de Smet, Chris Cox, and Brad McDonough. And then finally, I also want to thank all of the participants in several projects that have led up to the development of the recommendations. So here's a look at what I'll talk about today. First, I'll discuss why we're having a presentation on the topic of linguistic data citation in the first place. I'll give you an overview of the problem, and I'll talk about the formation of the Linguistic Data Interest Group. Next, we'll have a look at the recommendations, and I'll show you the templates for citation. I'll show you the elements of citation, and I'll give you some real examples to give you an idea of what's in the document itself. And finally, I'll close with some remarks about normalizing data citation in our professional practice. Okay, so let's get started. First, why am I here talking about data citation today? So the poor state of data citation in linguistics is actually not something that's new. Back in 1994, when Sally Thomason was the editor of the journal Language, she actually noticed that there were a lot of cases where the use of data is problematic. She wrote in 1994, she wrote an editorial that showed up in Language where she talked about this problem, and I'll read you a quote here. She said, "Because of the traditionally high standards of language regarding linguistic data, I have tried to identify cases where I may need to pay special attention to the accuracy of data. Cases where the referees found problems with the data, where the data seems to be incompletely attested, or where a spot check reveals errors. When I began my term as editor, I expected that there would be cases of this kind from time to time. I did not expect that these cases would occur frequently. So frequently, in fact, that the assumption that the data in accepted papers is reliable began to look questionable." And I think this is a pretty strong statement, considering that we're talking about Language, which is ostensibly the top journal in our field. In the rest of the editorial, Thomason offers some advice, including telling us to use our data very carefully, to describe and cite sources well, and to say how data was collected. So this is 1994. So fast forward to 2017, when some colleagues and I did a study of 270 linguistics articles in 10 journals across the discipline. So we looked at a number of different subfields, and we looked at different area specializations and things like that over a 10-year span. And what we were looking for was, how do authors of linguistics publications, of articles specifically, cite data in their articles? We were looking specifically at numbered examples found in the text of these articles. And what we discovered is that, in fact, data in publications don't generally have citations. So let me try to talk you through this graph. If you look at the leftmost bar of this graph, this is actually the number of cases in these 270 articles where data contained no citation whatsoever. And you'll see that the vast majority of the papers had no citations for their data. Okay, the bar just next to that, to the right of that, that is actually where authors were citing data that had previously been published in a book or a journal. In other words, this is the very standard citation of previously published work that we all know how to do. This is something that everybody does in all of their papers. All of the journals require it. We call it plagiarism when people don't do it. And so you can see that when data showed up in a prior book or article, authors were able to cite it. Okay, the rest of these bars basically show that this is all data that was never previously published in a book or an article, and therefore the authors didn't really have a good strategy for citing that data. And in the few cases where they did cite the data, the link to the actual data is so vague that it renders it almost unlocatable by any interested reader. Okay. So this was the scene in 2017. And at the time, I had been involved for a couple of years in an NSF-funded project to examine the norms of data citation in the field of linguistics. And in 2018, our group published this, which some of you may have seen. I'll put it in the chat box for you all. This is an open access position paper on data citation and linguistics that came out in the journal Linguistics. It has 14 authors, but it represents the collective opinion of more than 40 participants who had been part of our project over the previous 2 years. And I'll just read one passage for you. We basically wrote that linguistic data are the very building blocks of our field. Given that linguistic theories need to be borne out through the data, we believe that linguistic data are important resources in their own right and represent valuable assets for the field. Therefore, our field needs to accept responsibility for the proper documentation, preservation, attribution, and citation of these assets. The responsibility to do so is an integral part of linguistic research, and it should be collectively shared by individual scientists and researchers, data stewards, research institutions, and funding organizations. Okay. So this paper has actually been fairly widely read, which we're very happy about. And this was, as this paper was being prepared for publication, the group of people who participated in the writing of this paper then decided that we needed to move away from our mostly American focus. So we had been funded by the National Science Foundation up to this point, and most of the participants were American. And we decided that we needed more of an international platform upon which to discuss the issue of data citation, because it's not just an American linguistics problem, it's a problem worldwide. So this is when we sought out an organization called the Research Data Alliance, which some of you may have heard of. So the RDA is an international organization whose mission is to, quote, provide a neutral space where its members can come together to develop and adopt infrastructure that promotes data sharing and data-driven research. So this is a place where researchers and data scientists and data stewards from a lot of disciplines, a lot of data-driven disciplines, not just linguistics, come together to discuss issues regarding data. And inside the RDA, which by the way, anyone can join, you just have to, it's free, you just fill out a form and you have to check a box saying that you agree to abide by the principles of open science, and then you're a member. The RDA has within it a lot of special interest groups and working groups and nation-based groups and different groups like that. And the function of the RDA is basically to provide a space where groups can write recommendations, and then those can be vetted by the rest of the RDA membership and then adopted as outputs. They have conferences twice a year. They're called plenary sessions. They last a couple of days. In fact, just yesterday we had, right now is the current virtual plenary meeting, and just yesterday we had a meeting of the Linguistics Data Interest Group, which I can talk about during the Q&A period. So anyway, within the RDA, we formed the first linguistics group ever, it's called the LDIG, the Linguistic Data Interest Group. And this is right now a member network of about 100 international linguists. And our task has been to address issues of data citation in the field. Okay, so one of the things that we've been really focusing on over the last few years is this question of why don't linguists cite data? Why don't we do it? And there's basically two important answers to this. The first is that for the most part, we generally don't know why it's important. So there hasn't really been a lot of outreach of education in the field to explain why it's important to cite linguistic data. And the other problem is that we don't know how to do it. So if you remember back to that slide with the graph, right, the most common way of citing data was using the format that we all know how to do, right? We all know how to cite previous publications, right? But when it comes to citing data, we're not sure how to do it. Data is in so many different forms. We're not sure what we should put. Journal editors don't usually provide guidance on how to do it. And so a lot of us are just left kind of, shrugging our shoulders and saying, I just don't know what to do. Okay, so the LDIG has tried to address both of these questions. The first question of addressing the why, we came up with a document called the Austin Principles of Data Citation and Linguistics, which is this one. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this. You can have a look at it if you like. This was basically what we did for this document is we took an existing document called the Force 11 Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles, and we annotated it for linguistics. So it has about a dozen reasons why it's important to cite data. And we provided annotation that explains those reasons in linguistics terms so that linguists can better understand why it's important to cite data. And you can have a look at it. Like I said, you can even endorse the principles if you like. There's a sign up there to endorse the principles. But the other question that we have been addressing, and this is what I'll talk about today, is the how, right? And that's what the Tromsø recommendations are for. And so let me start to talk about that. So the full name of this document is the Tromsø Recommendations for Citation of Research Data in Linguistics. I like to call them the T-Rex. I think it's a little easier to say. I will put this document through in the chat box for you. Let me talk a little bit about how this document came about. It was something that we worked on from, I'd say, late 2018 through late 2019. In fact, we finished it almost exactly 2 years ago. And in fact, our plan for early 2020 was to go on a big public outreach campaign. And then we all know what happened in March of 2020. And so that's what we're working on right now. And that's what our meeting was about yesterday, was an outreach campaign. So the way we developed this document is through a series of asynchronous meetings of the LDIG. And you can see there we created a Google Doc that we invited all the members to comment on. And in fact, we also invited some people who are not members of the LDIG, so some journal editors and senior researchers and data stewards to also have a look and comment on the document. And the aim is to give concise advice, for data citation. And we wanted to take into consideration the vast variety of linguistic data that's out there. So this is intended to be a document for all subfields of linguistics, not just for certain ones, okay? And then the audience that we imagine using this is, for the most part, it's people like you, people like us, right? Individual researchers who want to know how to cite their data. But it's also for the gatekeepers. So people like journal editors and book series editors who provide style sheets and currently don't have information on how to cite data. They can also adopt these recommendations, and then their authors will know what to do. And then I provided the full citation there. So this is the outline of the T-Rex. Here you'll see it starts with an executive summary. And then we talk a little bit about the audience and some general recommendations. But what we mainly provide are recommendations for two types of citations that are going to appear in a publication. So the first is the references that will show up in the bibliography of a paper, right? And then we also talk about in-text citations in the body of the article, which will point to an item in the bibliography. We provide minimal templates and we provide expanded templates depending on how much information you have or information that you want to convey. We provide flexibility to fit with journal style guidelines. In fact, we're quite agnostic about style. We don't make any recommendations on, for example, the ordering of elements or formatting issues like what should be capitalized in a citation or what should be italicized. We allow the journals to provide that information in their style sheet, so it can really fit in with any style. We provide examples of citation using real data sets. So we put a call out for people in the world to contribute their data sets as examples for the recommendations, and you'll see those in there. And then we also have a glossary that gives clear definitions of the elements of a citation. Okay, so let's have a look at the recommendations. So in this section of the presentation, I'll show you the templates for both the bibliographic references and in-text citations, and I'll define each of the elements, and then I'll show you some examples. So as I mentioned, for the bibliographic references and for the in-text citations, we have both minimal templates and we have expanded templates. So the minimal template for a bibliographic reference includes these elements: author, date, title, publisher, and locator. And then the expanded bibliographic reference template includes a few other elements. First of all, other attribution and roles, version, and date accessed. And throughout this presentation and in the recommendations themselves, you'll see that we use green font to indicate required elements and purple italic font for what we call conditional elements. And conditional elements are those that are either specific to the resource. So for example, a versioned data set should include the version number, or those that may be part of a specific subfield tradition. So for example, in language documentation, which is my field, it's common to include the name of the speaker in some situations. Okay, so let's talk about the different elements. So first of all, we have the author. And the author is defined as one or more entities, which can be people or organizations, that are mainly responsible for developing the resource. Other roles besides literal authors can also show up in this first position. But if you have other roles, those are by default not listed. However, you can list them if you choose to. Next, we have the element of date. And so the default for date is the publication of a data set. And publication here is defined as when the data set became kind of broadly available in some way. Usually this is by being assigned a persistent identifier in a repository. However, if we don't have a publication date, we can use other kinds of dates. We can use a deposit date, meaning the date that it was handed over to the repository, or we could even use a collection date if we wanted. And you have some examples here of that. However, if the date that you're using is not a publication date, then you should mark it as to what it is. All right, next we have title. So title is the title of either the entire resource, if you're using the entire resource in your article or your paper, or it could be the title of a well-defined subpart if you're only using one subpart. So if you're only using one file or one folder or one section, you would use the name of that subsection. If, however, you're referencing multiple subparts of a single resource in your paper, then in the bibliographic reference, you want to cite the full resource. And then in the in-text citations, you can cite the titles of the individual subparts. Next, we have publisher. So publisher is the entity that's responsible for providing access to the resource, like an archive or repository. And if you're doing this, you should provide the name of the original access provider, rather than something like a metadata harvester, like the OLAC search engine, or a copier of the data. And then finally, we have locator. So a locator is ideally a persistent identifier of some kind that points to the landing page of the resource at the level that you used for the title element. Meaning if you're citing the entire resource, then the persistent identifier should point to the landing page for the whole resource. But if you're citing a subpart, use the persistent identifier that points to that subpart. And persistent identifiers can be several different kinds of things. These are basically different types of persistent identifiers. So you could have a digital object identifier, or a handle, or an archive resource key, or something along those lines. Right. If no persistent identifier is available, then you can use the URL of the repository and also include some kind of internal item identifier, like a file name or a collection ID or something like that that's used internally. If you're talking about a resource that doesn't have an online presence, right, that's not online, doesn't have an online locator of any kind, then instead of using this kind of locator, you can substitute the media type. So you can write something like CD-ROM or CD text file, something like that in that position. Okay, so those were the minimal template elements. And now if we look at the expanded template, we have a couple more elements. So the first one is other attribution and roles. And so other contributors, other people who participated, can be listed here, not just the entity that most closely matches the description of the author. So for example, you can list consultants, speakers, investigators, etc. And there are a number of defined and widely accepted lists of roles out there that you can look at if you are looking for ways to define your roles. So there's a couple of given here, so you can check out CASRAI or DataCite or OLAC. They all have defined lists of different kinds of roles that you could use in your citation. Version and date access, these both have to do with resources that may change over time. So if a version number is available, you should include it. Okay, but we also have a couple things that are kind of a proxy for version numbers. So if you have a resource that updates on a regular basis, for example, it's going to have a timestamp and you can include that timestamp. Or a Git commit ID also works as a kind of a version control element. If you give no version number in your citation, then it's assumed that the resource is stable and doesn't change. However, if you don't know whether a resource is stable, or if you have something that's dynamic, meaning it's likely to change without explicit version numbers or timestamps. And what I'm thinking about here is, for example, in language documentation, we may work on an Elan transcript, sort of iteratively. So we'd work on it for a while, deposit it in the archive, and then increase the level of detail and then deposit it without remembering to put a version number on it. And so in that case, right, you should use the date access, and that will stand in as an indication to the reader of what version of the data you are looking at. Okay, so let me show you some examples of these bibliographic templates. I'm going to start with a very straightforward example. This is a collection of documentary materials in the Paradisec archive. And you can see that we have a collector listed in the author position. It's Alexander Adelaar. In language documentation, it's sort of a tradition to put the role as something like collector or researcher, because we know that author isn't quite the right way to describe the person who's responsible for the resource. We also have a date, 2005. We have a title called Ma'anyan Narratives, and we even included the collection ID here, AA4. The publisher is Paradisec Archive, and then we have a locator, which is a DOI. Here's an example where the author is not a person. There's actually several here. So we have, the first one is a reference to the British National Corpus, where we can include the BNC consortium in the author position because they're the ones responsible for providing access. And then you see that the publisher is the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. In the second one, we have the INESS in this project listed as the author. And then in the third one for WordNet, we have Princeton University listed as both the author and the publisher. Okay, here's some references with some special dates, right? So the first one, the Hauk collection, this was published over a 2-year span. And so we've got a date range listed instead of just a single date. And then in the Prignitz reference, we have a collection date of 2007, and we've specified it as such. Okay, here's different kinds of locators. So both of these are objects that are not online. So the first one, instead of listing a digital locator, we've listed the media type. So it's a CD audio. And in the second one, the Ferrara and Ringsu citation, these are unpublished data recordings and annotation files. And I want to point out that because these objects are not online, it's going to be a little harder for an interested reader to access the resources, right? They're not going to be able to just click on a link and get to them. However, there are hints in the citation about how someone might be able to track down those resources. So in the second one, you'd have to get in touch with the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and talk to Ferrara and Ringsu about the data set. And this brings up an area that people have a lot of questions about. Just because a resource is not online does not mean you're not obligated to still cite the data that you use, right? And beyond that, citation doesn't entail or even imply that the resource is broadly open and accessible to anyone who wants to have access to it. And I'm happy to talk more about those issues in the Q&A if you like. And example number 5, we have some examples showing components of a data set and also showing variations of authors with other attributions. So the first set here is we have Hauk listed as the researcher and the depositor. We have Omar Papashvili listed as the speaker and Rezo Orbatishvili as the consultant. Then we have a date. We have a single file title here, and we also have the title of the entire collection. And so in a way, this one kind of resembles a chapter in an edited volume, right? And then we have the publisher and we have a locator. And this one is similar here. The second one, we have Krauss and Lear listed as the interviewer, and then Anna Nelson-Harry listed as the speaker. Here's the title of the individual item. Here's the title of the collection. right? And then same thing with the UCLA Phonetics Lab. Here's a individual file. Okay, so those are the bibliographic references. Let's have a quick look at in-text citations, right? So these also have templates. The minimal in-text citation template is not going to be a surprise to anyone. It's basically just author and date. If you want, you can just do it like this. We have an expanded option available as well, where you can also add locator, subset, or other attributions, where subset really refers to drilling down as close as you can to the individual data point by providing a line number or a timestamp or something like that. That's very, very small. Okay, so here's an example of an in-text citation where we've added a locator. In the first one, we're just using the file name as the locator. And in the second one, we're using the handle, the persistent identifier of a handle that points to that single file. In this one, it's the same example as the previous slide, but we've added a subset now. We're talking about a 2-second span in this file called BH2-076 that's inside of HALC 2018. And then with this one, we've also added a speaker name. So you see we have all of these elements. We have the author, the date, the file name, the subset of 2 seconds, and then we've also been able to give credit to the speaker. And this would be a really nice way to cite, for example, sentences in writing about language description. If a student of mine turned in a paper with a citation like this, I would be overjoyed. You might also want to cite something like grammaticality judgment data. So here, imagine that we have a spreadsheet that contains grammaticality judgments, right? We have, in fact, a collection of spreadsheets collected by Vera Gribanova in 2016. It's a collection of spreadsheets called Combinatorics of the Uzbek Verbal Complex and Polar Questions. And there's the locator. And then in the paper, here's your example sentence. And the way you can cite this is you have the author and the date. This is the name of the individual spreadsheet, right? This one CSV file, and it's item number 27 is this sentence. Okay, and then last example, we have citing an online corpus. Here at the top, this is a bibliographic reference to the choral corpus, the corpus of regional African American language. And there are different ways you could cite this one in the in-text citation. You could use the very minimal template of Kendall and Farrington 2018. You could also add a locator. This is an individual file name from this corpus. Or you could also add a subset. So in the first one, we've added a subset that is time series data. And in the second one, we've added a subset that is line numbers. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about the idea of normalizing data citation in our professional practice, or data citation and you. Okay, so what can you do? Well, most of us here today are researchers, and what we can do is we can cite our data, right? You can build data citation into your projects from the very beginning. Importantly, the recommendations are meant to encourage more citation in our professional practice rather than mandate some kind of perfection. So if your data that you want to cite doesn't conform to the examples that we've given, you can still do your best to include the relevant elements as you understand them. And then over time, as data citation becomes more common, we'll all have a better idea of how to do it properly. I also want to point out that data citation is related to, but distinct from, making underlying data available. And that citation can coexist with ethical approaches to archiving and access that maybe means that some data cannot be made public, right? We like to follow the mantra here of as open as possible, as closed as necessary when it comes to thinking about whether to make data shareable. And finally, if you're using other people's linguistic data, cite their data in your work. For supervisors, we can encourage best practice. We can introduce our students to the proper ways to do this in their work. An example of that is in my department at the University of Hawaii. We have required since 2013 that doctoral dissertations based on original field research have an archiving plan that has been executed by the time of the defense. And we will not approve a dissertation that hasn't properly manage the archiving side of data work. Journal editors can make citation an expectation. So the Tromsø recommendations can be adopted alongside other more commonly adopted style sheets like the generic style rules and the LDIG glossing rules. The Australian Journal of Linguistics, I think, did this within the last year or so. The flip side to this is that if you are submitting your work to a journal that doesn't require the citation of data, you can cite data anyway, because journal editors need to become accustomed to seeing that their authors are engaging in this process, and that will encourage them to then look for ways to standardize it for people who submit work to their journal, which could mean adopting the recommendations. Also, data managers can encourage citation. Most archives have a field on their site where it talks about how to cite data, making it very, very easy for archive users to cite the data that they find in it. Okay, so basically to summarize, right, linguistic analysis is built on a diverse range of linguistic data. And by citing that data, we can make the role of data more transparent in our work. We can give credit to everyone who's involved in creating the data. We can encourage reproducible research in our discipline. And we can also build a case for data collection and data work as part of the rewardable research outputs in our discipline. And there's one more small thing that I want to say from a personal point of view is that I think that citing data is the right thing to do. So as a documentary linguist, I am very attuned to the fact that language work is inherently relational, right? Language work is about people and relationships, and language itself is about people and relationships. And I think that data citation is likewise relational because it allows us to acknowledge the many people that are part of our language work. And so with that, I say thank you, and I'm ready to take questions.